Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session today on pathways to growth and expansion. We're going to start in just a few minutes. I know you're just coming in, just letting you know that there is the availability of chat and Q&A during this session. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for everybody to come in and we'll get started in just a moment. Alrighty, it looks like we have a critical mass in here. We'll go ahead and get started and hopefully others will join us as we're in progress. I want to welcome you. Good morning and welcome to the Prince George's County Economic Development Corporation's coordinated and hosted Pathways to Business Growth and Expansion program. This is a 15-part series being offered in both English and Spanish and is sponsored by Lerch Brewer. Today's programming, focusing on lease agreements and completing leasehold improvements, will feature Lerch Brewer's Anne-Marie Maylard, the principal, and from Lerch Brewer, and Associate Stephen Dunn. We are also joined by Nicole Reese, Business Development Officer from the Prince George's County Department of Permits, Inspections, and Enforcement. My name is Alicia Moran, and I'm the Manager of Small Business Services, and I am your host today. So thank you for joining us. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So what is the Pathways program all about? We have had a series of Pathways programs. It's all about helping businesses grow. So if you haven't joined us for any of the previous 15 sessions that we've done here in Pathways to Business Growth and Expansion, please go on our website and take a look at the series. We also have a Pathways to Procurement and a Pathways to Financial Management series. So please, this is all about growing your business. Join us, learn more. Next slide, please. This is just one of many programs that Prince George's County Economic Development Corporation actually provides to the business community. So I encourage you to visit our website, join the BizBuzz, and follow us on social media to learn more about our various programs, whether it's Takeout Tuesday, Business Spotlight, Pathways, or By Prince George's, or Creandus Exodus. There are lots of programs out there and lots of information on our website, which is Prince George's County Economic Development Corporation, PGCEDC.com. Next slide, please. So the EDC, what are we all about? Our core services are really here to be your advocate. We advocate on behalf of the business community. We gather resources and tools to bring them to the business community to support business retention, expansion, attraction, and support job creation here in Prince George's County. Our economic development efforts are part of a larger strategic plan based upon data and asset evaluation. Whether you need help with site selection, or pre-submission meetings, financing, incentives, the EDC is here to help you. Next slide, please. And it's not just me, it's a whole team of people here to support the business community. So please know that we have a dedicated, knowledgeable, and talented team of experts here to assist you, whether you're a manufacturer, a government contractor, a technology business, restaurant, retailer, healthcare company, service provider, or developer, realtor, etc. We are here to help you. This is your team here at the EDC. This is your business development team. And I just encourage you again to look at our website and to learn more about these team members and contact your industry representative. Next slide, please. As part of the small business services, we provide training, workshops, counseling, coaching, and so much more. We really partner with our industry and governmental resource partners to connect you to capital, expertise, and added support to grow your business. You should know that we have relationships with the Technology Development Corporation, Maryland Women's Business Center, Procurement Technical Assistance Center, Small Business Development Center, SCORE, the SBA, FSC First, and so many others. So please know we're here to be your resource to help bring you to the resources you need to help you grow your business. We are part of a dynamic ecosystem for both innovators and entrepreneurs. Behind me, you can see I'm an innovation station, and that is our collaborative co-working space and business incubator associated with the Economic Development Corporation. This is a dynamic place for businesses to grow, and there are several incubators and innovation accelerator entities within Prince George's County. So if you want to learn more about that, please reach out. Next slide, please. Again, lots of business resources. We encourage you to visit our website and to learn more about the programs and activities that the Economic Development Corporation is partnering with and bringing to you. Next slide, please. And I want to thank my colleagues, Crystal Ballard and Jordan Tillman, for being a part of today's program and helping to make sure everything goes smoothly. We can't do this without them, and we really appreciate them. Next slide, please. And without further ado, I'd like to really turn this over to our experts here from Lerch Brewer, Anne-Marie Merlat and Stephen Dunn. Geez, Anne-Marie, I'm gonna just, anyway, I need to apologize for the slaughtering of your last name.
That's okay.
I wanna thank you, and I wanna turn this over now to Stephen Dunn, who's gonna tell us a little bit about Lerch Brewer and their practice, and go into details on lease agreements and things you should know as a business owner before you sign a lease and as you sign a lease. Thank you very much. Stephen?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Dunn, and I'm here today with Anne-Marie Maylert. We're attorneys in the real estate department at Lerch Brewer, a law firm in Bethesda, Maryland. We're a full-service law firm with about 60 attorneys, helping real estate professionals and small businesses throughout Maryland, the DC area, including Prince George's County. As part of as being members of the real estate department, Anne-Marie and I do a lot of commercial leasing work. We represent several tenants and landlords and have worked on all kinds of different leases, some of which we'll talk about here today. But our focus today is we want to just give you the lay of the land, some general terms to deal with leasing, and then to talk about some specific issues that will most affect the day-to-day running of your business and your bottom line. Leasing is a very broad subject matter area. If we talked about everything, we could be here all day or probably all week. So if we don't cover anything that you want to talk about, there'll be a question and answer session at the end of our presentation, and feel free to reach out to us on the side. Next slide, please. All right. So what are we going to talk about here today? Number one, what is a lease and why is it important? What are the key parts of a lease? The work letter, the tenant allowance, operating expenses and taxes, default, and Q&A. Next slide, please. So what is a lease? A lease is a big contract that sets out the rights of one person to use and occupy the property of another. The person who owns the property is the landlord, and the person who is renting the property is the tenant. From a business perspective, the lease is probably one of your top two biggest expenses year over year, next to salaries. So it's a very important part of your business, and for landlords, their business too, because they depend on the rent for income. There are many different types of leases. No two leases will be the same. There's many different types of landlords, from the very big and sophisticated real estate investment trusts to smaller landlords that own a shopping center or even a commercial condominium unit. There's office leases, retail leases, warehouse, restaurant. No two leases are going to be the same. We're going to talk about some general rules and issues here today that we think apply to all of them. Next slide, please. So the lease key terms, and as I said in an earlier slide, we're only going to discuss some of these in a lot of detail, and others we're just going to mention. The premises is where a tenant occupies, where the tenant pays rent to the landlord to be able to use. The commencement date or dates, Anne Marie's going to talk about this in more detail in a moment, but these are the dates generally when the tenant has access to the premises, and for important to the landlord, when the tenant has to start paying rent. Rent, we probably all know what that is. Additional rent is an issue that I'm going to talk about. In addition to the X dollars per month to occupy the space, what else does a tenant have to pay? The term is how long a tenant has to or is going to occupy the property for. Triple net or gross, I'll talk about that more in additional rent as well. That depends on, that concerns what types of charges are passed through to the tenant under a lease. The work letter talks about how we get the premises ready for tenant to open business. Anne Marie's going to talk about that. Default is when either party violates any provision of the lease and what they can do about it. Insurance, there's different insurance requirements that either party may require for the lease. Use restrictions, what a tenant can do and cannot do with a property. And options, sometimes tenants have options to extend, cancel early, or even an opportunity to purchase the property. We won't talk about that too much, but if you have any questions, let us know. Next slide, please. I think Anne Marie, this is you.
Am I on? Sorry, guys. The critical dates in a lease, actually, I think this slide's a little bit out of order from ours, so it may have to back up. But I don't know, Crystal, sorry about that, but I think this, we can talk about it now.
I can move on to additional rent and we'll circle back to this.
Right, why don't we do that? Thanks.
Okay. Next slide, please. All right, so additional rent. What is additional rent? Additional rent are, it refers to amounts that a tenant has to pay the landlord in addition to the monthly rent. There's two main types. On one hand, there's operating expenses, and on the other hand, there's taxes. On the second or third slide, you heard me mention triple net leases and gross leases. In a triple net lease, all of the additional rent, or at least most of them, get passed through to the tenant. So the tenant has to pay for everything. In a gross lease, everything is included in the gross or in the monthly rent. There isn't usually anything else that the tenant has to pay. And there's a running spectrum between the two extremes. Most often, the triple net lease is what you see. So let's talk about the types of expenses that get passed through to tenants. The first is operating expenses. What are these? Operating expenses are the costs for maintenance, cleaning. Sometimes it includes insurance, property management, utilities, other issues like that. So types of services that might be included: janitorial services, trash removal, landscaping, window cleaning, elevator maintenance, pest control, especially for as it relates to common areas. So if your building has a lobby, has a parking lot, has elevators, has a shared loading dock or trash removal bay, those are all common areas, and the tenants are going to pay their proportionate share. I'll define that in a moment, of the cost to keep those areas up and running and clean. It also covers utilities, sometimes just for the common areas, sometimes for the entire building or project. Utilities, as you probably know, includes water and sewer, electric, gas, and if it covers the whole building, if each premises or storefront in the building doesn't have its own submeter. If each unit is submetered, then all the tenants will probably pay their own utilities, but then share the cost of utilities to cover the common areas. Operating expenses also cover supplies. So for each service I mentioned, you're going to need supplies to make sure that the services can be provided. That's cleaning services, or cleaning supplies, gardening supplies, light bulbs, sometimes uniforms, etc. And then sometimes insurance is also included in operating expenses. Sometimes it's its own category, but usually not. So if the landlord has insurance coverage to cover the whole property from damage, casualty, in a triple net lease, a lot of times the tenants will share the costs of the of those insurance premiums. So as a tenant, what do you want to do when you're negotiating a lease? Landlords are going to want to define operating expenses as broadly as possible. After all, you know, if they're receiving rent and any expenses relating to the property beyond the rent deduct from their profit. So they want a broad definition of operating expenses. Tenants, on the other hand, they probably want to narrow things down a little bit. So what are some examples of expenses that are not usually considered operating expenses? Some good examples are the landlord's mortgage and deed of trust. If the landlord pays a mortgage payment, that payment, interest, principal, any late fee or service fee, etc., tenants should push to make sure that's not an operating expense. And most landlords will probably agree. There's leasing and marketing expenses. So if there's another tenant in the building and the landlord paid a leasing commission to get that tenant to move in, if you own a different business than that tenant, you probably don't want to pay that leasing commission to the landlord. The landlord paid that leasing commission to fill a different space in the building. There's a really good reason why you shouldn't have to pay it. Sometimes landlords don't push back much on that either. Work for other tenants. Anne Marie will talk about this later, but when you're getting ready to move in, the landlord will often do some work to your premises to make sure that you're ready to move in and open your business. The landlord's going to do that type of work for other tenants too. And their business might be different than yours. It's reasonable to ask the landlord to not include that as an operating expense. I talked about utilities a few moments ago. If the building is sub-metered, you shouldn't have to pay to share utilities with any other tenants, at least relating to units. The common areas are a different story. And then also, if the landlord's going to receive reimbursement for any expense, it's reasonable for a tenant to say, hey, you're getting reimbursed for this. I don't think I should have to pay you for it because you're going to basically double dip. That's also reasonable, but the landlord will probably come back and say, okay, I agree, but let's make sure I actually get paid before you don't have to. A lot of times where you'll see that is with insurance deductibles or with warranties for, big appliances or fixtures, things like that. And then finally, two other categories: landlords overhead and profit. Landlord might have some direct employees or contractors that serve your building or your project where a tenant's business is located. How many of landlord's employees should a tenant have to pay for? A good rule of thumb is everyone, up to the building manager for the particular building. It's okay and reasonable for a tenant to pay reimburse landlord as an operating expense for their salaries and expenses. But anyone beyond that, the tenant has a good ground to push back. After all, if the tenant has if the landlord has a different building 10 miles down the road and there's no relation between the buildings, why should a tenant have to pay for a property manager or someone else at that different building, someone that they never interact with, someone that doesn't do any work for them to help keep their lights on? Another category is costs related to the sale of the building. Oh, I'm still on the right slide. I'm just going into more detail. Costs related to the sale of the building. So if you have an ongoing lease and in the middle of your lease, the landlord decides, I want to sell my building. The landlord's going to have expenses related to that. Lawyers with the contracts, probably a commission for the broker. And there might be, different charges related to financing. That doesn't relate to a tenant's day-to-day business. And it's very fair for a tenant to ask to not have to contribute towards those fees. And then finally, capital expenditures. The capital expenditure is when a landlord or any property owner spends money to make a big improvement, usually a new improvement or addition or alteration to the building. If the landlord wants to make their building nicer by upgrading it in some way, that's a business decision that they have to make. It's not always the case that the landlord should be able to pass the cost of that upgrade down to tenants. But one time or one or two times when they can is when those improvements are required by law or intended to promote reducing operating expenses or promote fire safety. So sometimes you'll see landlords say, all right, you don't have to pay for the new facade, but we're going to add more sprinklers because the fire code was updated. Can you help pay for that? A lot of times, that they might not budge on that, and it's reasonable to acquiesce there because it benefits you too. The sweet spot really when you're negotiating operating expenses is, you want the operating expenses to relate to the building where the tenant has their business. You get too beyond that, maybe the landlord is getting a little more than they need. If the scope is narrower than that, then the landlord is going to lose profit. We'll stay on the same slide, and it's a very similar analysis, but we'll talk about taxes. Taxes are another thing that's passed down through to tenants as additional rent. The main types of taxes that are passed down to tenants are real estate taxes and other governmental assessments or levies, and also water and sewer charges. And I'm not talking about water use. A lot of jurisdictions, they'll require your property owners to reimburse the town or the city or the county to install water and sewer facilities to serve their building and make sure that water and sewer is available there. Some taxes that tenants should push back on are more of landlords' business type taxes. Income taxes, inheritance taxes, franchise taxes, estate taxes. Again, the sweet spot is you want to try to limit the scope of the taxes that a tenant has to pay as additional rent to where the building is located primarily. Anything more than that, the landlord gets a windfall. Anything less than that, the landlord's probably losing money. There's other types of additional rent that I'll just mention. We won't talk about them in detail right now, but if you have any questions, let me know. If the tenant's in default and the landlord has to pay to cure the default, sometimes that will be passed down as additional rent. And then also insurance premiums when the lease treats them differently than operating expenses. So if you have any questions about additional rent, let me know at the end. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Anne Marie to talk about the build out.
Scott, Steve, can I ask a quick question? So these are expenses that a potential tenant may see in a lease agreement. Is that what you're meaning, correct?
That's right, yeah. So the tenant will pay their base rent, which is usually a set monthly amount. And then the tenant, at least in a triple net lease, will also have to pay additional rent. And that includes certain operating expenses and certain taxes. And that could change from month to month.
Thank you.
Okay, can we go to the next slide? I'm going to be talking about building out the space. First of all, good morning, everybody. Don't see you all, but I know you're out there in cyberspace somewhere. When we were asked to do this for this session here, I kind of went back over my years of practice and who I've represented and what the key points were, what their touch points were. Steve and I have represented restaurant owners, retail owners, large, small office space owners, not owners, and also tenants. We do both sides. Today, we're focusing mainly on the tenant. And my tenants are primarily, they're interested in three things right off the bat. When can I get into the space? How much am I going to pay during the term? And if I have to, how do I get out of the lease? Stephen focused on the operating expenses, and that's what you're paying during the term. That is something that it's additional rent. You pay a pro rata share of the landlord's cost to operate the building. I am going to focus on when you can get into the space. That is the build out that we're talking about. The build out. We're talking about when does the lease commence? When does the rent commence? Oftentimes you find a spot, a premises, and you're pretty sure you want it. It's not exactly what you need. So you talk to the landlord. I need this in the premises. I have to do that. I have to make these alterations. That's when the negotiations begin. It's all part of the negotiating of the rent and the space you want. When you build out the space, you're building it out for your use. Your use is going to be defined in the lease. You're not going to, you will not be able to do anything you want in the space. The lease is going to say you can be a restaurant. You can be a clothing store. You can be an office tenant and nothing else unless the landlord lets you. So for those, you're going to have to make some alterations to the space. The lease is going to govern how you make those alterations. It's going to govern your initial alterations, and it's going to govern the alterations that you do during the term. If you want to make any alterations during the term, you're going to have to get the landlord's approval. I often try with tenants to say, I can do cosmetic. The tenant can do what we call cosmetic alterations. You can paint, you can change the carpet without getting landlord's approval. Those are things you can negotiate in the lease, so you don't have to be so reliant on the landlord. The initial alterations is what we're kind of going to zoom in on here, because that's where you're getting your permits. You're getting your right to get into the space. You want to negotiate those alterations before you sign the lease. They should be part of your lease. They should be an exhibit to your lease. The alterations, next slide, please. The alterations for the space before you start your business is usually found in the work letter. The work letter is an exhibit to the lease, and it defines the roles of the tenant and the landlord. You want it to clearly define what the landlord has said he's going to do to the space and what the tenant is going to do. In going forward with trying to see what the landlord wants, what the tenant wants, and the landlord's got approval rights, you want to set an approval process. The reason why you want to set this approval process is because time is of the essence. You don't want to say, landlord, here's my plan, can you approve it? And then the landlord takes 3 weeks and you're sitting out there with your business, or you've got another space you got to get out of. So you want to say, okay, let's include a time frame. I give you my plans, you have to respond within 10 days. If you don't respond, then I'm going to deem them approved. You want to say, what is a tenant delay? Tenant delays, and this will get back to our critical dates, if you change your mind during the build out process for your space and you want to put in a different type of counter that's going to take a few more weeks, they're going to call that a tenant delay. And the reason that's important is because it may not move your rent commencement date. So you may have to be in that space paying rent when you're not ready to open up. So you want to be clear in the work letter, what is a tenant delay? Usually it is something when you come back and you change the plans, and that change makes it go out farther. It is not a delay in getting permits. It should not be a delay because the landlord's contractor couldn't get to the space on time. It should only be something that you've requested. Next, it will set forth the requirements for the contractors. Most times, if the tenant is doing a lot of work in the space, tenant will get its contractor, but landlord wants to approve the contractor. And then it'll say who obtains the permits. I know we're going to talk about permitting later on in this session, but it should be very clear who is going to get any kind of construction permits or building permits, and who is going to get that all important use and occupancy permit. Is it the landlord? Is it the tenant? That's going to be in the work letter. Next slide, please. After you find your space, you want it, sometimes in an office building, not so much in retail, but in office buildings, the landlord will do a test fit. In other words, let me see if you fit all the cubicles and offices you want in here. Ask for the test fit. They often will do it for you. Then you're going to develop the plans. What is it going to look like? And then you're going to decide who does the build out, the tenant, the landlord, or a combination. In office spaces, if you're a small tenant in a large office building, 9 times out of 10, landlord's doing the build out. Landlord has the contractors in space. If you are a large tenant in an office building, you may have the leverage to say, I want to do it. Or sometimes you can have a combination. Landlord will do X amount, tenant may do the finishes. That is all negotiation, usually on the table. Next slide, please. When landlord performs the build out work, the positives for the tenant are the landlord already has its contractors and architects in place. He knows the building. He can probably do it and get going a lot quicker. The landlord should be responsible for getting the permits, including the use and occupancy. Since they are the ones doing the work, they should be running the permitting process. And they're responsible for costs. Now, most time landlords will say, this is what I'm giving you. And if it goes above that cost, they want to collect it from the tenant. But for most spaces, particularly office, and I'm focusing on office with landlord because when you get into retail, it's a little more particular and sometimes the tenants get more involved. But the landlord will finish the space for you and not charge you anything for his alterations. The negatives when the landlord performs the cost, the negatives for the tenant, you don't have control over timing and the build out process. Again, this could be crucial if you are trying to get out of a space, you're waiting for the new space to come up and the landlord ran into some delays. He had to pull some contractors to do some other work or something. You're at their mercy. It also may be more difficult to make any changes. You're going to have to go in and talk to the landlord, try to get the landlord to approve the changes. And again, it may not be as easy as or flexibility that you'd like to have. And then finally, you'll have to usually settle for the landlord standard finishes. You know, the landlords, if they're in an office building, will have their standard finish. They have the same kind of walls, the same kind of carpet, the same kind of paint. That's what you'll be getting in a landlord build out. Next slide, please. If the tenant performs the build out work, you've got control over the build out. You can make minor adjustments and changes without the landlord, delaying it or saying no, and you can control the costs. You can do some value engineering, and which means that you're going to look at things and say, okay, we'll not take this, but we'll take that and save some money there. Again, the landlord's got to approve all your plans and changes to plans. And I would say here, this again goes back to that approval process. You want to have a time-sensitive approval process if the tenant is doing the work. You'll have to go out and find the contractors. Sometimes you can use landlord's contractors. Sometimes the tenant will want to, go out and do a 3-bid process, but it's extra time and extra work for the tenant. You'll be responsible for obtaining all the permits. So again, that'll be on you and not the landlord. And if for some reason your contractors get held up or something along the way, that may not delay that rent commencement date. I mean, we'll get back to that in a minute. Next slide. This is a checklist for items, but before I get to that, can I go to the next slide? The tenant allowance. This is something where the landlord is going to give you some money to build out your space. It is oftentimes part of the negotiation process with the rent. It's not free money. Think of it more as a loan from the landlord. Rather than have to go to the bank to get the cost to build out your space, the landlord's giving you funds. How's he getting it paid back? He's increasing your base rent. This is something where he will say, okay, if I give you $50,000 to build out your space, your rent per square foot may go up $2, so that over the life of the term of the lease, he gets paid back or she gets paid back. So it's not free money, but it is an excellent way for a tenant to be able to have that upfront cost spread out over the term of the lease. when you're negotiating the tenant improvement allowance, and again, this is usually found in the work letter, you want to be sure that the landlord is going to disperse it to pay invoices. The landlord's first draft of the lease may say it's going to reimburse you after you've finished building out the space. That means you've got to come up with the costs first. You don't want that. Most landlords will agree that if you give me an invoice, if the contractor signs a lien waiver, then I will pay the invoice. That's what you want. Usually you won't get that in the first landlord lease. You should ask for it. The other thing you want to focus on with the tenant improvement allowance is what can it be used for? You'll have plans and you'll say, these are the plans. This is what I want to use the improvement allowance for. But what if you save some money? Can you use it to buy office equipment that doesn't mainly stay with the space? You take it when you leave at the end of the term. Can you use it at the end if you find you've got a balance? Can you use it to credit against some rent? These are all things you should be asking for. A lot of times landlords do not want to credit against the rent, but the way I look at it is you're paying for that money. It's based in your rent. So there is no reason why, if you've been able to do some value engineering and save some costs, that you should be allowed to credit against the balance of the rent. So those are key things to look for if you're using a tenant improvement allowance. Then I can go back to the next slide, the checklist. Checklist for items relating to the allowance. I know we've talked on some of these. I'm just going to breeze through them. Plans for the alterations to the space. Who drafts them? Many times it'll be the landlord. If you're, like I said, small tenants, landlords are doing this. Landlord's work, it's going to be defined in the work letter. See what they're doing. Don't just like sign off on a lease and say, oh, landlord will come up with plans. Talk to the landlord beforehand, sit around a table, figure out how your space is going to look. What are his standard finishes? What is he going to be doing to the space? Same with the tenant. If you're doing the plans, get them in front of the landlord as soon as possible. You want to know if they're going to be any problems, if he's not going to, or she's not going to want that type of finishes in the space. And who obtains the permits? Again, decide who's going to do that and put it in the work letter. The tenant allowance, we just talked about, how's it used, how's it's dispersed? Can you put it against any extra allowance towards the rent? The approval process, do the timeframes. Landlord gets 10 days to approve your plans. And if he has problems, and it's a process. If they have issues, they have to give you those issues within 10 days. You go back, you revise your plans, you give it to them again, then they have 10 days. Sometimes I shorten that process, then they have 5 days to get back to you, and so on until you've got an approved process. I can't tell you how many times people get hung up because the approval process slows down the construction. How long is the construction period? And this is kind of where I wanted to get back to, that critical dates in the commencement lease. If we could find that slide.
Slide number 5.
Great, that's it. Okay. This is how your work letter, your build out of the space affects your lease. The commencement date of the lease is generally when landlord delivers you the possession. Now that could be two things. One, if you're building out the space, you're getting space that you're going to have to do some construction in. You're not going to be opening up. So you don't want the commencement date to be the rent commencement date. Those are going to be two different dates. If the landlord's building out the space, he's going to deliver you the space completed. You'll be able to unlock the door, walk in, set up your computers, and get to work. The commencement date is probably going to be the rent commencement date. So if your commencement date is, if you're doing the work, the tenant is doing the work, you've got to be really careful to make sure, one, your commencement date is when the landlord delivers you the lease, delivers you the space, and it could be an as is. Hopefully it'll be broom clean, but you'll have to do work. You want to negotiate a construction period of time that can allows you to do work before you hit the rent commencement date. You've got to allow for permitting, you've got to allow for construction, and I would give you some extra time in there also before the rent commencement date starts. During that period, you should not be paying rent. Rent says either the rent commencement date hasn't started, or if they want to say the rent commencement date starts, the rent is abated during that period. You are not open for business. You are not getting any money from that premises, so you should not be paying rent. Now, if there's delays in construction, you've gotten, COVID hits, can't get it built out in the 90 days you were supposed to build out. If it's a force majeure event, if it's because of something the landlord has done, you want to be able to say you want to move that rent commencement date. Oftentimes I will say for every delay in construction that was not caused because tenant changed an order or something, I get it 1 extra day before that rent commencement date starts. So that's kind of the commencement date, rent commencement date. The other thing about the rent commencement date is it can say like 90 days after the landlord delivers the space. That's your 90-day construction period, or when the tenant opens for business. If you were able to get that place built out in 60 days, the landlord's not going to let you open for business and not pay rent for another 30. So it will be either the number of days of the construction period or when you open for business. And that's probably about it in the critical dates. It's going back to the checklist, and the work letter, the initial build out is crucial to you. It's crucial to you for costs. It's crucial to you for when your lease commences and when you can get into the space. And it's something that you want to talk about with the landlord prior to signing any lease. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a few questions that I wanted to ask of the Lerch Early team. So how do you manage a budget with the triple net lease? What's the best way to manage your budget with the triple net lease?
I can take that, Steve. The triple net lease is you are going to be it's not a month-to-month charge, although you pay it monthly. Normally, the landlord will tell you in January that your costs, the additional rent, the additional cost for operating expenses and taxes is going to be X amount a month. And therefore, you will be paying that X amount for that year. Then the next January, they may say, okay, it's going up a little bit. Here's what it is. Some landlords try to say they can adjust that whenever they feel like it. I always push back and say you can only adjust it once or twice because we need a budget. So, it's a it's a proportionate share. So if your space occupies 20% of the building, you're paying 20% of those costs. You're not paying all those costs. The other way you can budget it, and I see this more and more, is to say negotiate a cap. So that every year, except for what we call uncontrollable expenses, those expenses can only go up 5%. So you're not, going into the year that your expenses, the maximum they can go up is 5%. Uncontrollable expenses, the landlord will not agree to cap. They're usually the utilities. Snow removal is a big one, and insurance. And if taxes are in there, taxes also. So, and the whole way this triple net kind of works is that the landlord at the end of the calendar year looks back and sees how much you paid during the year, because those were estimates. The landlord wasn't sure, but he estimated as good as it can what those costs would be. Then he looks at how much you paid, what his actual costs were, and then it kind of reconciles it. If you paid too much, you get a credit, usually against the future costs. If you paid too little, landlord wants to collect it from you.
Thank you. Another question, we also have some restaurants and bakeries on the line. And so are there any tips or lessons learned in lease agreements, some things that you've seen, advice that you might give just based on experiences you've seen others go through?
I think with restaurants, and I've represented a few, I think you gotta control the costs of the build out. Oftentimes, you know, the restaurant is, it's their dream, it's their passion, and they know exactly what they want it to look like. A restaurant where the build out was over the top and it was beyond their budget. It was kind of like, well, we'll just do this and hopefully we get it back. It has killed so many restaurants, the build out, because you got to remember two things. One, you're paying for it somehow, either in upfront costs or through your rent. And two, you don't get those great finishes back at the end of the lease. They are the landlords. Other than equipment that's movable, everything else stays in the premises. And I just have one quick story if I got the time. I represented, actually it was a landlord who had a tenant, and the tenant, again, he operated a restaurant, very good restaurant. It was open for several years, did some finishes midway through, put, you know, fancy floors in, fancy walls in, even the lavatory doors were kind of custom made light fixtures. When he closed the restaurant, he took everything with him, tore up the planks of the floor because it was this, you know, type of barn wood, took off the lavatory doors, took down the light fixtures. He got in big trouble. And he ended up owing that landlord hundreds of thousands of dollars. So think about that for restaurants in the build out process. It's important to remember, you don't get to keep the stuff. You don't get to take it with you when you leave. And I've seen more often than not, a very expensive build out being the nemesis for a successful restaurant.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are going to go back to some additional questions as we go through. We're going to let Deepai and Nicole Reese do a quick presentation, but I want everybody to be thinking about, you have experts on the line. So, and Anne and Stephen, just so you know, we're going to be coming back to you to ask for 3 to 5 top tips, you know, that people should take away with them in a lease agreement. So be prepared for at the end there. We're going to come back for a couple round robins at the end. We're going to turn it over now to Nicole Reese, and I want to thank our Lerch Early Brewer speakers. And now we're hearing from Deepai and related to the build out process from their standpoint. Nicole, turning it over to you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Reese. Thank you for allowing me to speak. We are sort of the last stop before you open up, so it is critical that you speak with me. I'm going to give my information out. There's a lot of things just on the permitting side that you should learn and know about. So next slide, please. A little bit about our section. Again, my name is Nicole Reese. I'm a business development officer with the business development section in Deepai. It is a new section. The goal of this section, it's been around about 2 years, is to help businesses navigate Deepai processes as well as liaison with other agencies. We support the growth of a thriving and diverse commercial business community, and we provide guidance and assistance through the permitting and licensing process. Next slide, please. We also coordinate with agency personnel to facilitate the completion of paperwork and document review. We educate businesses about Deepai requirements and processes. And as I mentioned earlier, we serve as a liaison with governmental agencies, between governmental agencies and entrepreneurs. Next slide, please. One of the important things, we do get confused with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which is a zoning commission. Zoning review is an important part of the Deepai permit approval process. Before COVID, we actually MNC PPC, and I'll just say Park and Planning, was co-located with us. Now that everyone is virtual, they're still working on our permits. So when you apply for a permit, your application is reviewed by zoning simultaneously while it is being reviewed by DPI. We cannot issue any use and occupancy permits until that approval has been done. Sometimes we get confused because there's a holdup on the Park and Planning side. And so there's a confusion about whether it's DPI, the applicant, if it is either the business owner or the architect or your design professional. You can log in and see actually the status of all of the reviews and where it is at, if it's with DPI. Occasionally, sometimes the state highway system will also be involved and will need to give approval, and all of the agencies have access to the same system. And so you need to look in there and see which agency it is held up with. But if you have any confusion, you can reach out to me. Another important point is that when you're looking at space and you're going around with your real estate agent and negotiating your lease, we recommend that you get a letter of determination before signing a lease. That is something you can get from Park and Planning. It is only $50. It's relatively cheap. You can fill the form out online. Here's the link, but it's on their main webpage, and you can be very descriptive in your what you plan to do at that location. There may be limits. You may need a special exception, and all of these delays are important for you to know before you sign a lease, where you have a commencement date. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time either because I want to be conscious of everyone's time. But I have seen so many nightmares where, again, the lease is beginning and all of these things are coming up now, and you have to start paying rent and you have no income. So it is important that you, if you're going in a space that is the prior use was exactly the same, then it's probably not going to be a problem. But if you're going to add anything additional, I mean, I've talked to businesses where, for example, it was a restaurant and then they want to sell something and they want to have a coffee shop. So you're changing the use of the space. So you actually should make sure that will get approved. Sometimes the landlord may not be aware that those particular nuances will not be allowed. So just keep that in mind. Next slide.
And Nicole, I just wanted to add, just real quickly. So Prince George's County Economic Development Corporation, that's why it's so important for businesses to come to PGCEDC as they're starting this process as well, because as you're pointing out, planning and zoning, DPI, state highways, there are many different agencies involved in business growth and expansion efforts. And so it's important for people to get the support they need as they're navigating their way through this process. So I want to thank you for always being our partner, first of all, and then let you continue on. But you're bringing up a very important point. So thank you so much for doing that.
Definitely. And definitely if you're located on a corner, a lot of, again, sidewalk, park and planning, if you're on a major highway, a lot of those things come into play. So the more, as you're saying, Alicia, that you know up front, you can, as you negotiate your lease, you can give yourself time. And so zoning approval is needed for a lot of everything basically, but if you're building on vacant land, if you're adding addition, a lot of people actually are surprised that when they say, wait a minute, that's another zoning approval. Yes, if you're adding addition to an existing business, if you're changing the use, and it could be minor. I mean, I talk to people and they're going from retail to barbershop and they just don't understand why they have to go through this entire process. But it is a process and it's a long process, but that's for another day, and feel free to reach out to me. And we also talked about this in December. If you're changing the exterior of the building, even with sign permits, you should, that is actually approved by zoning again. So those are important factors to keep in mind. Next slide. A lot of tenants, customers don't realize, they don't know what a building permit is. It essentially is a build out. That is the county code regulation. Official name is a building permit. And again, per county code, if you're erecting a building or a structure, Unless exempted by the building code, you're enlarging, structurally altering, moving, or adding to a building, or excavating, you're going to need a building permit, which is essentially a construction permit. And that is a lengthy process, and where you're going to hire design professionals, architects. You're going to submit a full set of plans for that. So if you, again, are trying to change the space drastically, you definitely need to give yourself time for that, and make sure that your rent is not due before all of this has been completed. Okay, next slide. Again, you will need a use and occupancy. That is not to be confused with the building permit, and that is essential for every commercial business. This gives you permission to occupy the business, regardless of construction or no construction. If you're not doing any construction, it's pretty easy process. You can usually file for yourself, but what that says is that you're allowed to legally be there. It meets local zoning and safety requirements, and you may legally operate at that location. If there's a change in tenancy, or your sister used to run that business and you need that, you're now running that business, and it's a different name, you have to change it. It needs to be your name on your business name on that use and occupancy. The property owner also has to file if you know the land is property is transferred or sold. The use and occupancy must be updated on behalf of the landlord as well. There's no grandfathering. You can't say, well, I say you bought the Chick-fil-A from someone, it's the same name. It has to change to reflect the current business owner. Any work that was done, unfortunately, if it was illegal work, when you go through the inspection process, you may be asked to submit a permit for that or correct that. It may not be up to code. We see that a lot where changes were made. There wasn't a permit that was filed for that work. And usually the inspectors can tell, especially if it's a very old building, but you have new bathroom fixtures, knobs, and then they look in the system and there's no permit. So these are all things to keep in mind as you're navigating DPI. Next slide, please. And so you have to go through an inspection. That is really the last stop. We have an MOU with the fire marshal. So for certain types of businesses and uses, particularly large assemblies, malls, there has to be an inspection approval by the office of the fire marshal. But we do we also do inspections, all of the inspections. So even with the office of fire marshal, we will come in after that. We're, again, the last stop. The inspector is the one that actually approves the issuance of a final certificate of occupancy. So the most critical thing is to remember a UNO permit is not a permit for construction. That is a building permit. You must possess a building permit. You can do both together. I've seen folks do a building permit and then they later have to do a UNO. You can do those simultaneously. That will save time. It's called a construction and use permit. I recommend that. And sometimes there's situations where you might have to break it up, but please reach out. I'll put my information in the chat, but it's also available at the end of the slide. Please reach out to us or me or the permitting office and zoning if you have any questions. Next slide. As mentioned on the previous slide, there is a use and occupancy checklist. There's a link there, but I just did some quick screenshots. It's very technical. Your contractor is, if you're using a professional, they know this list. They should know this list. And so they know all of the technical terms, all of the fire alarm, sprinkler, everything, exit signs. Do you have a sign up? Do you have a permit for that? If the inspector sees a sign installed without a permit, you're going to get a correction order for that. Next slide, please. And again, this is just a continuation. All of this, you know, I'm not going to read all of the list of things, but these are just things that the inspector is looking for when they come out. They're going to check off all of these things just so you can have an idea of what the inspector is looking for when they're going through your space. Next slide, please. Next slide. That's still continuing. So the top 10 hints that I would give would be know the timing of your project. It's essential. Again, we've all talked about that when you're negotiating your lease. I hate to be on the end when I hear business owners literally in tears or crying. This is your livelihood and you have no income and you're looking at a $6,000 rent due, for example, and you have no way to pay that. Get a zoning determination prior to signing a lease. Try, if you can, to go into a similar prior use space. It's going to be cheaper instead of doing the entire build, unless you have lots of money to do that. But if you just baby steps, if you can locate a space that is similar to what you're doing, that's going to be the best scenario. When you're buying, particularly inquire about prior permits or insert research online. I've had situations where they went in blind and then there's all these things they had to do, again, thousands of dollars, and they did not know that up front. I encourage to hire a professional, particularly if you're having to do a building permit. Our system is very complicated. It's designed for engineers and architects to use. And I spend a lot of time along with DPI staff helping solo business. So I know you want to save money, but helping solo business owners navigate our e-plan system. And again, time is money. So if you spend too much trying to figure out how to upload plans versus paying someone to do it, I encourage you to really consider that, because again, as time is ticking and rent is becoming due and you're trying to make income and salaries, this is all critical. Be very descriptive when filing an application. Inspectors are looking for that when they come out. They're going to be looking for that. So when they come out and you said, I'm running a daycare, and then they get there and they see a restaurant, and that's an extreme situation, but that's going to be a problem. So again, it's going to stop you, delay in your business. If you are doing, a restaurant, consider third-party programs, especially if you're in a timeline where you want to get open. We do have one that is our peer review program, which is not as expensive as the higher tier third party. You are paying to jump the line, but it is worth it, particularly if you want to get open really fast. When the inspector comes for an inspection, this is for business owners who are just doing a very small project. They don't want to hire anyone. Have your plans on site. It's very stressful to have for the business owner to get delayed another 2 or 3 weeks because their plans are not there. They're with the architect. Because they pay for the architect, but they decided to navigate our system themselves. And so the inspector is going to actually leave. They're not going to be able to give you your final certificate of occupancy. Ask your contractor to add you to e-plan. So if you are going to hire a contractor, a professional to do your application, we now have the feature to have you added, your email login. It's only view only, but it is actually pretty enlightening to see what's going on, because sometimes your contractor may not be telling you the whole story. There are times when there's something due, there's a task. Now, I know that sometimes it does go to spam. That's been a situation. So, but 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and we wait on DPI, and then you log in and you see that there's a task for the applicant. So if you stay on top of this as a business owner, you can actually see what is going on. And again, check e-plan regularly. This is your livelihood. Log in, check emails, check your spam. You will be getting the notifications along with the contractor as well to know what the status of your project is. Next slide. And that is it for DPI. Here's my information. You can email me and reach out to me if you want to have a consultation before you either sign a lease or, I really encourage to reach out before you sign a lease. But in case you have signed a lease and you still, need information, I am available. And that is it for me.
Wow. Thank you so much, Nicole. That was wonderful. And we are so glad that you work in partnership with us and that you are there at DPI. Can you tell us at what point do you need a building permit versus just completing cosmetic updates to the space? And that may be for you and the Lerch Early Brewer folks. So we'll let both of you answer that. At what point do you need a building permit versus just completing cosmetic updates to the space?
So I'm trying to understand at what point do you need a building permit? Is this one, is it in the, let me read the question just to make sure I understand it. Or is this something, okay, I see. Well, what point do you need a building versus just completing cosmetic updates? So at the point that you probably, at least from DPI, I mean, once you have hired your professionals, and they've done all the plans, you're going to have a timeline from your contractor. I mean, it's just like, and we can start January 20th. We have a 4 to 6 week review period. Okay, so you need to calculate all of that when you're signing your lease. So if you want to open May, I would say right now would be the time, because 4 to 6 weeks typically, and then if there are any corrections or revisions, for example, your architect files your building permit application. It goes through the regular review process, and then there's some comments. That could be another 2 to 3 weeks. So each revision is 2 to 3 weeks. I hope I'm answering the question, but essentially, I always say give yourself 2 to 3 months. I mean, at a minimum. I mean, I'll be honest. Because you never know what sort of hiccups you have to. And remember, you have to, if you're doing new plumbing, you got WSSC, that's an entire different agency, that you may have to work with. You may have to work with the electrical. So there are other agencies that are not in our queue that you may have to work with to get approval for the entire thing to come together. So when the inspector comes out, they're looking at a combination of Department of Health. If you're building a new kitchen, going through NARA, our health supervisor. So all of that, you need to kind of backtrack and make sure that you have enough time. And your architect will tell you how much time they have to do your plans. I mean, I've talked to people, and sometimes they're really, architect may say it will take 5 weeks for me to civil engineer to get you everything that that you need to be approved. I hope I'm answering the question, but anyway, follow up if I'm not.
You are, and I just don't. Anne Marie, anything that you want to add, just based upon things that you've seen take place? You've probably seen some of these situations,
right? Yes, and I think with the difference between a cosmetic alteration and an alteration with respect to the lease, if you are moving walls, if you are in any way affecting the structure, if you are in any way affecting the building systems, the HVAC, the electrical, anything of that nature, that's not cosmetic. That is, you're gonna have to go to the landlord with plans and get an approval, and you probably have to go to DPIE. If you are just painting or carpeting, those type of things, I would say are cosmetic. I don't think you would need a permit. The landlord, you're trying to say, landlord, I don't have to run to you every time I want to change the paint color. Although I have a story where a landlord did require that because he came in and there was a hot pink wall that he had to paint at the end of the day. So the painting, alterations, hanging pictures, those things that even though you're putting nails into the wall should be cosmetic and should not need landlord approval, and probably, and I think Nicole can say, probably don't need a permit to go ahead and do those things. Structure, putting up any kind of walls, building systems, doing anything with the HVAC, doing anything with the electrical, doing anything with the plumbing, you're gonna need landlord approval, and you're gonna have to go get a permit for it.
Correct. I didn't probably understand the question, but you're right, you're correct. Because obviously just the definition of a building permit, any structural changes, any kind of structural changes, you're definitely going to need a building permit.
Thank you. This is why it's good that everybody's on the call today, because all these things are complex. This is why we're always saying, please, please, please come to your friends at PGCEDC as a starting point. One of the questions in here is, what is the most appropriate place to identify properties for lease? And so we had a session earlier in the Pathways to Business Growth and Expansion that talked about site selection. So PGCEDC can assist with site selection, as well as there are resources like CoStar. You can work with a realtor, you can work with brokers. we encourage you to leverage all your assets and really understand. And again, the starting point is making sure you're going to a site that is actually zoned properly for what it is that you are trying to do. And this was one of the points that Nicole was making earlier. You can go to planning and zoning to get a determination. Is this property, in fact, usable for the use we want to, how we want to use it? And so if they're saying no, then you should not be signing a lease for that particular place unless you're going to go through a process, and there is a process to make amendments to this in some way, shape, or form. But that's a longer process as well. So to Nicole's point as well, if you're going, a restaurant, try to find an existing restaurant that you can take over. It will be less costly, less expensive. But anybody else have any other input on most appropriate place to identify properties for lease? Any other thoughts from Anne Marie or others?
For what I primarily see is the broker. I think there are many of them out there, and they're hustling to get business. And not a good broker will not only know the best place to lease, he'll know what the rents are, should be, what the market rents are, what we call factors in the lease. What is the standard tenant improvement allowance for this building? They will have a good broker. He'll know the business terms of what is market out there. And oftentimes I have people come to me and say, do you think this rent is good? And I honestly don't have that. I don't have that knowledge. I am not out there on the street knocking on doors, getting what all the different rents are paying. Can I get a 5-year term? Can I get a 10-year term? Should I have a renewal term? Brokers will really walk you through it. It's worth it. Normally the landlord pays the commission, so it's not even costing you anything to go out and find a good broker.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry, I muted myself. I was just looking through the questions to see if there was anything else. I think that we've answered all the questions that I'm seeing. I just wanted to remind the audience that you have a great panel of experts here. So if there are any other questions, please go ahead and put that into the Q&A. And they're saying, is a broker a real estate agent? I'll let you.
And yes, primarily. A broker usually hires real estate agents, but you can use a real estate agent. I shouldn't use those words interchangeably, but that is what it is. Yes.
So there are commercial real estate
agents.
Correct.
Yes. Don't use a
Versus
residential agent. You need a specific commercial real estate agent. Yes.
And broker. So yes, please, there is a distinction. In other words, if somebody's selling homes, that is not the person necessarily that is going to be able to help you find the commercial space that you may be looking for.
Correct.
So just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so let's get our top five tips ready. I don't see any more questions coming in. So if there's any, okay, we've made it 5. So Scott said, let's go for 5. So Stephen, I don't know. Let's go for some lessons learned, some things you've seen, some top 5, things that may trip people up. Give us some tips and major takeaways that everybody should take away from this meeting today.
Sure. So here's my top 5 tips, and not necessarily in the order of priority. Number 1, Anne Marie talked about this. Make sure you negotiate the end of the lease. If you own a restaurant and you have a fancy chandelier or a custom wooden bar that you install in the restaurant and you want to take it with you, make sure the lease lets you take those things with you. The landlord might say, as soon as you attach it to my property, that becomes my property too. You can get out ahead of these issues by negotiating it on the front end. Number 2, we talked about this earlier too. Make sure you negotiate what is not included in operating expenses and negotiate the cap on operating expenses, how much it can increase from year over year. One tip to do at the very beginning is a lot of times landlords will put in an estimated operating expense in the lease. So for the base year of 2022, we would estimate the operating expenses for your premises to be X dollars per year. It's good to try to get, that in there as an example, so that way you can better plan your budget for this year and moving ahead. Number 3, Anne-Marie talked about tenant allowances. One thing to ask for is what happens if you don't use your entire allowance? As a tenant, you should ask the landlord, hey, you gave me $100,000 to build out my space. I only used 90. Can I turn that last $10,000 into a rent abatement? A rent abatement is a credit against the rent, so basically free rent. If you don't ask, they can't say no. So just make sure you ask. Number 4, make sure you negotiate what a default is. A lot of times landlord form leases will say, if you don't pay rent, boom, you're automatically in default and I can do X, Y, and Z. You want to have cure periods. So make landlords say, hey, you didn't pay your rent, and then give yourself 10 days to pay the rent before you're in default. Similarly, number 5, a lot of times tenant rights under the lease, they're conditioned on if default. Tenant has the right to do this unless they're in default. A lot of times you'll see this with extension options or renewal terms. Make sure that default is conditioned on beyond any applicable cure period. So if you don't pay rent one time and then you pay it back within the cure period, make sure the landlord can't use that against you if you want to extend your term at the end of the lease. Anne-Marie?
All true. And I think to add to that, you're hoping that once you sign this lease, you're going to throw it in a drawer and forget about it for the term. So I think what the initial thing is get the work letter, the build out, get what you want in that space upfront before you sign the lease. That means get that work letter signed off. You know what landlord's going to do. You know what tenant's going to do. You know how the permitting process is going to work and who's going to be responsible for that. Your tenant improvement allowance, negotiate it. How much are you getting? You can ask the landlord, how much does this increase my rent? Maybe you're willing to go with a less allowance for a less rent. It's all in your budget. It's all upfront. It's all on the table. Let's negotiate it, talk to the landlord about it. 3, put timing in the lease for approval process. The last thing you want is to have to get landlord approval and he's too busy with another tenant to focus on you, and you're sitting there twiddling your thumbs waiting to get moving. Timing is crucial in a lease. And probably, I think, after hearing all this, I would think that one of the top things to take away is go to Nicole. That was a great presentation. I'm like thrilled to have that as I'm taking that slide deck and her top 10 because it is so helpful. Go to Nicole, go to Alicia. Those are the people out there who can really help you right off the bat. I'd love to help you all too. I love leasing. I love helping tenants get their buildings off the ground and getting their businesses going. And like I said, my goal is to help you put that lease in the drawer and never look at it again. I'm that insurance, and that's probably my top 5. I don't even know if I did 5, but that's kind of where we're coming from.
That's excellent. Okay, Nicole, anything else? You've kind of done your top 10, so I think we have what. But if there's anything else that you wanted to add, no.
No, I think I hit, all of the concerns that I have when I interact with businesses. Yes.
Very good. So there was one final question that was, what's the difference between a lease and a renter?
A renter is someone who leases. If you are the renter, you're leasing the space, you're the tenant.
So you're signing a legal document that legally obligates you to make payments to utilize that space.
Yes.
Okay. So just wanted to make sure that everybody's understanding. So when you're entering into a legal contract, that's why we have a law firm presenting here today. That's why we're grateful to have Lerch Brewer as our partners, because they are here and they are experts in the legal field. And often people may not think about that, but your legal representation may be something you want to bring in to consider as well when you're entering a lease agreement, because they may be able to review a lease for you to give you some guidance and insight as well. So we want to thank all of our speakers here today. I think it's been a fantastic session. I would say our top 5 takeaways from Prince George's County Economic Development Corporation is please, please, please remember to utilize the free resources out there that you have. Start with your Prince George's County Economic Development Corporation. Make sure you're working with planning and zoning to make sure that the zoning is the right zone before you get into a lease. Make sure you're talking to DPI to understand the timelines and the guidelines that they have, because until you get the use and occupancy, you cannot get in to actually use and occupy that space. So make sure that you're negotiating with your landlord with the understanding of all these other elements at play, and to make sure that you are also getting your lease agreements reviewed and understanding that you are signing something that is legally obligating you. A lot of people act like, oh, it's a lease and they can just break it. Well, you need to look at what are the out clauses to a lease. How do you legally get out of a lease? Do you have to give 30 days notice? Do you have to give 6 months notice? Are you on the hook for rent due? These are just things that you need to look at. So don't view it as this is agreement and you're going to stick it in a drawer. You need to understand what you're signing and make sure that you are protecting yourself as a business owner, first and foremost. And that's it. I think for me and maybe from everybody here, any other final notes from any of the speakers? And if not, no, Anne-Marie, you look like you were ready to say.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So thank you all so very much for joining us today for another great Pathways to Business Growth and Expansion sponsored by Lerch Brewer. And we really appreciate all of our speakers and partners here today. Thank you and have a good day. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye.